Bill grew up he actually was born in Atlanta, and his father, C.C. Baggs, actually was one of the first Ford dealers in the state of Georgia in the early 1900s. And so he was kind of born into an affluent family. But 3 weeks after Bill was born, his father died. And then his mother died when he was about 11, almost 12. So he was sent to live with two aunts in Colquitt, Georgia, his mother's sisters. Now, what's interesting is all through childhood, his middle name is Calhoun, and all through childhood, he was called Calhoun. And I didn't realize this when I first started researching in Colquitt. So I would say, have y'all ever heard of a guy named Bill Baggs? And they would go, no. And then when I said William Calhoun Baggs, they were like, oh, you mean old Calhoun? So that's how they knew him. And what was fascinating is his uncle, William Dancer, had a portable lumber mill and employed both black and white millers. And Bill was often found in the company of the black workers. He would read to them and would tell them stories, and he loved asking them their stories. So he was developing this really rich affinity for the stories of people who were on the margins, who often did not get asked questions. But I actually put an ad in the Miller County Liberal because I wanted to find people who actually knew him if they were still around. They would be in their 90s. And a few people actually answered the ad, and one of them was this woman who was 92 at the time when she wrote me. And she sent me a newspaper clipping that had a picture of him when he was 14 years old in his Sunday school class. And she said, oh, I remember him really well. She goes, I was 2 years behind him, so I know he didn't go to school. He came to the school when I was already there, so I knew he hadn't grown up there. And he started a newspaper almost right away, and called the CES Flashes, which was the Colquitt Elementary School Flashes. And it was little pieces of gossip, sports, people who were on the honor roll that he would have mimeographed and he would sell for a dime. So immediately he was already a newspaper guy as a kid. And it's interesting that he was called Calhoun. That's because he's descended from John C. Calhoun, the architect of the Confederacy, vice president to Andrew Jackson, creator of the concept of interposition. So that Bill would become this activist journalist on behalf of civil rights is a really profound shift in their family. Another detail that I found really interesting too was his guardian was actually a judge named Alexander Stephens, who was the great nephew of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy. So he was steeped in 300 years his family went back 300 years in the South. So he was steeped in the ideas of separation of the races. I mean, he very much grew up in that. But he witnessed a lynching during his early teens that of course, had a profound effect on him. And the family lore goes that he was sitting in church, and one of the people he saw commit the lynching was passing the offering plate. And at that moment, he had a real distinct break. From that moment on, he would call himself an atheist. Now, his writings and and the friendships he developed later with clergy speaks to that he had a very spiritual aspect to his life, but he constantly would get into arguments later on with ministers and preachers because they were using the pulpit to defend racism. So that was his childhood, and he had an opportunity to he had an appointment to the Naval Academy, or he could have gone to college, and he said no to both. Here's the valedictorian speaking about how you should defend your country and how you should get an education. And he hops a ship to Panama with his sister and brother-in-law, who has been employed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to work on the canal. So he goes with them to Panama and works as a stevedore and at the Panama Star and Herald. World War II breaks out while he's down there. and he enlists in the U.S. Army Air Force because his older brother, who's older than him by 10 years, is already with the Mighty Eighth in England. So Bill ends up becoming a bombardier on a B-24 that flew out of Venosa, Italy, which were the ones that bombed the marshalling yards and tried to cripple on the Eastern front Hitler's oil supply and railroads and all of that. So after he is sent to Miami Beach for rest and reassignment. And it's interesting because in his letters, even during the war, he's always talking about, well, when I get back, I want to just live in a small coastal town and have my own newspaper. He's talking about this as like he's just going to be a columnist at a small paper, and this is his big dream. So there's evidence that he was reading both the Miami News and the Miami Herald when he was there, because he would talk about things he had read. And he meets a woman named Joanne Orr, who he nicknames Freck because of the freckles on her face. She's a Red Cross worker. She's a Red Cross recreational assistant, and they meet at a dance. It's totally, from here to eternity. It's the classic, meet in Miami. But they get married in July 1945 and finish out the war in Tampa. And then he goes looking for a job after the war. And he can't find one for a long time. And then he's like, well, I guess I'll do insurance, or I'll do something like that. And he actually is successful at selling his first insurance policy to a man he realizes doesn't need insurance and can't afford it. So he actually tears up the policy, gives it back to him, and says, I just need to be a newspaper man. That's how I'm wired. That's how I'm built. So he gets a job in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then during that winter, it's a very, very cold winter. He is sick several times. And because they don't have a car anymore, so he has to walk in the snow and he's like, I don't want to, he goes, this is too cold for me. So he writes this plaintive letter. In fact, to me, it's one of the worst letters ever written to ask for a job because he's just so humble in it. You can tell that his spirits are kind of low when he writes this. So he writes it to Hoke Welch, which is the best name, Hoke Welch, who was managing editor of the Miami News, and says something like, I'm a decent reporter. I have no talent. It's just like this sad plaintive. Can you give me a job? Well, Hoke Welch says, we don't have anything right now, but I'll keep your stuff on file. The classic, I'll keep it on file. But Bill actually takes a job in Key West that turns out not to be what it was promised. Gets in his car, drives back up to Miami, to the Miami News, walks in, introduces himself to Hoke Welch, and says, I'll take any job you have. And at the time, Miami is this burgeoning aviation hub. It's the first city to ever have an aviation director. It's the birthplace of Eastern Airlines, Chalk Airlines, Pan Am, all of this. So all of this is happening. And the barnstormers that did tricks out on Miami Beach. So it's a great place. And since he was a bombardier, that's how he sold himself. He goes, I know planes. I know how to fly. I know how to do that. I can write about this. So he does. He becomes an aviation reporter for the Miami News. And pretty soon he's getting known by people, and they start sending him out on a speaking circuit for the news. And at the time, this is the interesting thing. Miami News was a really good newspaper. It already won its first Pulitzer by the time, but it was also a big red baiting newspaper. It was vehemently anti-communist at a time when Miami was becoming a hub for communist infiltration into labor unions and into Latin America. So because he was writing about aviation, naturally he started writing about transportation and labor issues, and gets this scoop to write about the testimony of this guy named Paul Crouch, who was a member of the Communist Party USA. And so he writes about his testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And all of a sudden, Bill's articles are shared nationwide. He gets his own column after that. The publisher sees that he has an interesting take on things. And so he gets his own column in 1949. So from 1946 to 1949, he's a reporter and then gets a column. So he's one of the youngest columnists. And at first he thinks he's going to be a humor columnist and just sort of his take on, Miami and the world. It becomes pretty clear that that's not what he's built for. He's humorous, and he uses humor in a lot of ways and is very punny and can be sarcastic. He was inspired by H.L. Mencken, Mark Twain, George Bernard Shaw. These were writers. He liked their voices. And so he sort of mimicked their voices early on, but he started focusing very heavily on housing in Miami. And the way the developers and the banks and the city and the county would redline and force Black citizens into just these few neighborhoods. Overtown, what was called Colored Town at the time, Overtown, a portion of Coconut Grove, and Liberty City. All of these areas together had about 150 people per acre, whereas white communities had far fewer. I think it was like under 10 per acre. And so they didn't have, the building codes didn't require plumbing for multifamily housing. I mean, these places were just geared to be just terrible living conditions. So he started writing about that, and he just kept the needle on that all the time. Like every week there was an article or a column he was writing about it. And he started writing about education very early on and the need to build better schools for Black citizens. So he was starting to take a position, albeit moderate, within the pages of the newspaper. And he would also refute that Black citizens tended to be communist. I mean, that was one of the prevailing, they were socialists, they were communists, they're going to communism, like that big Red Scare was also factoring into race issues, and he was consistently refuting that in his his column. Then they send him to Europe to go see how the Marshall Plan is working, and so he actually goes into Yugoslavia. So he's building this pattern of being much broader than the humor columnist he thought he would. He's able to, he's also building this reputation as someone who always he'll talk to the farmer before he'll talk to the city council member. He'll talk to the person. So he's developing this relationship where he can talk to the man on the street as well as one in high position. This is the time he's developing his friendship with Ralph McGill, who was the venerated editor-publisher of the Atlanta Constitution. He becomes friends with Harry Ashmore, who's the editor of the Arkansas Gazette, who also introduces him to Adlai Stevenson. So he's starting to develop these relationships with people in very high places, and also getting known as someone who, he's not in awe of people with big titles. This is what I find fascinating too, this really humble beginning. He doesn't have awe for people who happen to be running for president. He kind of tells it to them like, there's letters back and forth, even with Kennedy, where he goes, I know your people are telling you to listen to this person, but that person actually doesn't know what's going on. You need to listen to this person who's on your staff, but you're not paying attention to them, and they do know what's going on. Please listen to them. I mean, he was, and he had no qualms. Just if he learned something, he'd fire it off and say, you got this wrong. So he starts developing this reputation, but he also develops a reputation too as being the best person to invite to the cocktail party, because he's full of stories. He's a blast to be around. He's got his gin and tonic or his gin martinis. So he becomes this person who's a great storyteller. And so as his profile goes up in 1957, just before Governor Cox dies, who owns the Miami News, the Atlanta Constitution, the Dayton newspaper. Just before Governor Cox passes away, he wants to make some changes in Miami and wants Bill to become editor. He passes away, but his son, who takes over Cox Media, ends up fulfilling his father's last wish, which is that Bill become editor. So Bill is named editor in 1957 at the age of 34, which was the youngest editor in the nation at the time. And then he fires anyone who has anything to do with red baiting. He just fires them from the start. He's like, that's not who we're going to be. We're going to be a writerly paper, and we're always going to be outspent by the Herald. So we're going to be good writers, and we're going to talk to people, and we're going to get the story, and we're going to tell it differently. They can send 3 reporters. We can send 1. We'll send the best reporter, you know. So he starts hiring people who end up going on from the news later on into big positions all over the country. Like Jim Bellows becomes his managing editor, who ends up taking over the New York Herald Tribune, helping Clay Felker start New York Magazine, hires Jimmy Breslin. I mean, like there's this, and he always gives Baggs the credit as the person who taught him how to be an editor. So it's this wonderful. So then, when he becomes editor, he meets the Reverend Theodore Gibson, who is head of the NAACP and is the spiritual leader of Christ Episcopal in Coconut Grove, the mother church for the Black community there. And both of them are kind of at their wits' end by the time that they meet in December 1960. Bill doesn't see much happening in the way of desegregation in Miami. He's very aware that there's still so much effort in Florida to because the northern part of Florida still controls the legislature. The state hasn't been apportioned yet. While Miami, South Florida had 10% of the population, it only had 3% of representation within the state capital. And they were vehemently racist. And he would get into these fights with like Senator Charlie Johns, stuff like that. So, and they think the reason why Charlie Johns lost his 1955 bid for governor was because Bill's hammering him on apportionment. So he meets Theodore Gibson, who also is thinking about leaving the church at the time because, again, he's gone through the ringer with the Supreme Court. He's been accused of harboring communists in the NAACP in Miami. He won't turn over the membership rolls, and they're trying to send him to prison for that because the state of Florida actually had a mini House Un-American Activities Committee. It was called the Johns Committee. It was Senator Charlie Johns. So Bill Baggs and Reverend Gibson meet, and they become the closest of friends, and they start working together. And that's when Bill really becomes this activist as an editor. He starts helping negotiate the desegregation of department store bathrooms and tea rooms and dressing rooms. He goes on the circuit talking about, you know, how we need to work in the schools, economic opportunity, voting opportunity, hospitals. And he starts even talking to his friends and his neighbors that are doctors and saying, you know, you need to open up your hospitals. You know, this is ridiculous. And so in all these ways, he becomes very active, which then leads him into other avenues, like with the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which then leads him to Vietnam. I mean, like, it's so interesting. Like, once he sort of turns that corner, he becomes someone who is not just reporting the news, but helping shape the news.